Welcome back to another Man v Mob mini episode. I think we realistically need to ask what we can expect moving forward. And by that, I mean the big notions of what we were trying to achieve for the last several hundred years have been democracy and capitalism. And although many people think we exist within those systems, we actually don't. They are idealizations, and we approach them in some ways, but we don't actually have a democracy, and we don't actually live in a capitalist system. And I think we need to ask what is actually achievable and what type of system should we approach, and what do we actually live under. So in regards to capitalism, what we really live under is a corporatist system. So if you think about what capitalism is, it's free markets that are entirely unregulated and allowed to basically the invisible hand to regulate themselves and set prices, and the notion that self-interest at a massive scale creates a um, sort of a mediator to the market. And if you look at the system as it actually exists, we have tons of regulations, tons of interference in the economy. So the 20th century alone, the idea of deficit spending in Keynesian economics, and the notion of regulation, and what eventually came about as regulatory capture, which is effectively colluding between the regulators and the industry leaders who are being regulated, that exists at a pretty major scale. So we have a Frankenstein monster economic system that is not actually capitalism. It's not communism either. It's somewhere in between the pole of those extremes of entirely free markets and entirely economic planning. So I don't know what you would call it other than a form of corporatism right now. And with democracy, by the way, let me step back and say that one of the reasons why we don't have pure capitalism is because it's really not something that you can have at a large level. Capitalism, and the same thing with communism, actually becomes increasingly unstable as you scale it up. So if you have a market with 10 people, then you can set a pretty easy understanding, and it's possible that the notion that Adam Smith, the guy that was all about capitalism, it's possible that you can have that notion that people are acting as rational actors, which that's a presupposition of capitalism. But as you get much larger, then it's much more difficult to determine who is engaging in the market. You're getting people behaving irrationally. You're starting to realize that based on human psychology, even the most rational people often behave irrationally. And um, and that as you get above about 150 people, the people no longer know each other. The system gets very complex, and you need a form of regulation, particularly for the various externalities that can arise, and the forms of corruption, and the forms of scams and things like that. And so what you get is a regulated system, which inherently isn't a free market. Now, with communism, you can have a commune of about, I don't know, up to, once again, about 150 people, where the fewer the people, the better, because they can work approximately equally, and really have a sense of who's doing what, and fairness. And there's no everybody is society, or the commune is flat. There's no hierarchy. But once you get above 150 people, things start to get confusing, and then you need a layer of management. And once you have a layer of management, then you no longer have a flat system. Now you have a very simple hierarchy, and it only gets more complex from there. So once you try to scale up capitalism or communism, you end up destroying the theory and getting some new reality. And it's the same thing with democracy, where if you think about what we actually have and what democracy assumed, just like what capitalism was assuming, where you would have rational people who were engaging in the system, and that's what preserved it. That's a pretty major assumption that you're getting. You have to remember that they're leaving the age of reason in this new faith in um, in the human intellect, in the human capacity to uh, change its understanding over time with the scientific method, and to be able to reason out of any problem. So it was basically replacing the old notion of orthodoxy and um, paranoia and superstition with reason, but it was a new faith in reason. And so you can understand where this idea came from, where, oh, we're just going to assume everybody is rational in this system that we're devising, in this idealization. So the same thing with democracy, where the founders, at least of the American democratic system, or is really a constitutional republic, but the notion that the people themselves should be the voters, or should be the voice of reason in this system, and they should have representatives that act for them, because having a system where everybody votes would be utterly chaotic. But it was assuming that to the oil or the gasoline to get this engine to continue to function was an educated and rational public. And and while they did acknowledge that you get factions and people who behave as demagogues and people who behave irrationally, they assume that the vast majority of people are going to be rational. And that is definitely not the case. We can see that effectively what we do have is a system where we have a minority of people who, to an extent, understands these complex systems that are in play today, whether it's the economy, the banks, various industries, educational systems, all of that. You have people who are technocratic and who lead those systems and who have a better understanding of it. And then you have the public face, sort of figurehead, which is voted for in the general election. So really, the president and the vice president and the other administrators are just an elected representation of the influence that people think that they have, when in reality it's people who have far more understanding than the person that the public elects. And there's a winnowing down through, there's sort of an artificial selection process of the candidates that actually make it to the election stage to begin with. And then what you end up with basically is the masses of the people at the mass level are largely ignorant, and they aren't very educated on any given topic, particularly the increasingly complex topics. So, particularly ever since the debut of television and mass media, mass visual media, people have turned the election of presidents into a popularity contest and a decision of how much is this person like me? How much of myself do I see in this person? Because I think there's an identity tied into it of, I want to believe that I could do this job too, or that I'm participating. So I'm not sure how much this is actually true, but in the past, I think maybe it was more, I want to vote for somebody who is fairly different from me and who I just think would be extremely competent. So it's like, all right, I'm just going to trust that that person's going to get stuff done. And I don't need to understand maybe everything that they do or say. But today, it's more like people trying to think that they ought to understand every decision and everything that the president would be doing, or at anything that uh, really would be important from an industrial or economic standpoint, or in a political standpoint and a national standpoint. People like to think that yeah, I get this, or that it's as simple as just a Democrat Republican division, and one set of policies or the other set of policies is just, if only the other side would just back off and we could implement our policies, then things would be fixed, when in reality it's basically two groups of people voting, or two parties of people voting on their preferred flavor of propaganda, of mass propaganda, and then people in the background who just do what they're going to do in their technocratic, highly intelligent way, and um, effectively there's a disconnect between the two. And I think cracks are starting to show in that system, and people are starting to suspect conspiracies at play, like, shadow government and stuff like that. And that's not wrong, purely because the sense of the people who are elected are just people who are really charming or charismatic or good people pleasers or whatever, that doesn't make them particularly adept at um, at operating and understanding massive complex systems. So there is a major disconnect between people's notion of the democratic system that they think exists and what we actually live under. And let's not forget that the idea of democracy, the idea of capitalism, any ideology is a fiction. It's an idealization of something that actually doesn't exist in the real world. And in trying to implement it, you fall short of what you're trying to build. And you try to maintain the illusion that basically what you're aiming at is what you actually have. But we need to focus on, if we're all pretty much realizing that this isn't what's actually in place, what do we have moving forward? Do we have some type of system where we, almost like a public trust, we take the brightest, most capable people, and we educate them in as much social history and government um, and try to reinforce compassionate notions of humanity as possible? Or do we have some type of other system that can approximate democracy, where people who are truly uneducated on a given topic can uh, self-reflect and say, I shouldn't vote on this topic because I clearly don't understand it? That seems a bit far-fetched to me, but these are questions that we really need to ask, because the traditional notion of democracy, where everybody's vote counts the same, is rather upended when you consider how somebody who really is engaged with the topics and educated on all different issues, their vote counts the same as somebody who, knowing nothing, walks into the voting booth and decides to cast their vote for the person who they thought uh, looked the best, or was the most earnest, or had the most yard signs or something like that, or who their parent was voting for, or who their spouse is voting for, or any number of reasons which are not sophisticated, but at the mass level add up significantly. So that, I think, is one of the major reasons. It's like democracy functioning against itself, because if the majority of people aren't educated or informed, then how do you actually have a functioning system? So, something to mull over. Let me know what you think.